Interestingly enough, the name of the malady was coined decades ago by a Japanese psychiatrist when Japanese tourists were the main Asian travelers to the capitals of Europe. He noted that his patients frequently returned from Paris ill and depressed, and when their idealized view of the city, based on films and advertisements, bumped up against the harsher realities. So it seems as if this syndrome is a product of contemporary... Interestingly enough, the name of the malady was coined decades ago by a Japanese psychiatrist. For the main Asian travelers to the capitals of Europe. He noted that his patients frequently returned from Paris in which experience and values are constructed by when their idealized versions of it have been around in advertising travel bumped up against the harsh. The travel literature of the 18th and 19th centuries helped to create travel as a product of contemporary. Interestingly enough, the name of the malady was coined decades ago by a Japanese psychiatrist. He noted that his patients frequently returned from Paris in which experience and values are constructed by when their idealized versions of it have been around in advertising travel bumped up against the harsh. The travel literature of the 18th and 19th centuries helped to create travel as a product of now. Interestingly enough, the name of the malady was coined decades ago by a Japanese psychiatrist. He noted that his patients frequently returned from Paris in which experience and values are constructed by when their idealized versions of it have been around in advertising travel bumped up against the travel literature of the 18th and 19th centuries helped to create now. Interestingly enough, the name of the malady was coined decades ago by a Japanese psychiatrist. He noted that his patients frequently returned from Paris in which experience and values are constructed by when their idealized versions of it have been around in advertising travel. The travel literature of the 18th and 19th centuries. Interestingly enough, the name of the malady was coined decades ago by a Japanese psychiatrist. He noted that his patients frequently returned from Paris in which experience and values are constructed by when their idealized versions of it have been around in advertising travel. The travel literature of the 18th and 19th that without a European tour, one was forever destined to be unsophisticated and culturally stunted. A man who has not been in Italy is always conscious of an inferiority from his not having seen what it is expected a man should see. After all, few people brag about a trip to Disneyland the way they do about a trip to Rome or Paris. And no matter how unpleasant or how much graffiti and trash they encounter, when you hear them back in the States, they are experts on wine and love to give people advice. So somehow the link to culture and sophistication remains. Paul Fussell and others have claimed that real travel is no longer possible, let alone real travel books. Everything is just about tourism now, as technology and mass tourism itself have made travel just another form of consumption. But travel has always, in one form or another, been about consumption. Even the voyages in the heyday of the Grand Tour involved a rather organized itinerary with much must-see sites, must-read books, and must-have purchases. Paris, Johnson talks about having to go get a new wig and where to go to buy the best buckles for your shoes, how to get a new hilt for your sword. So all that kind of advertising was as popular then as it is now. And it was more important to bring those things home as proof of your learning and sophistication. Indeed, this was precisely the point of the Grand Tour as it developed. Its patterns became more regular, and the assumptions about where a tourist should go became more predictable. Paris was polite society, the center of civilization and arts, and Italy was the potent center of classical culture. Travel there was the ultimate symbol of taste. Indeed, the term itself, Grand Tour, reflects a sense that this was the ideal fusion of tourism and social status. And the ideas of culture and sophistication that a protracted voyage offered were spread through the publication of travel narratives, which both advertised the traveler's learning and reinforced a sense of adventure and privilege. The literature magnified the impact of tourism and went a far way in actually creating the experience for tourists themselves. the way films and advertising now. Those grand tourists needed to see certain sights, acquire certain knowledge, and return home improved, not simply to have had a good time. The emphasis on learning and education became so pronounced that a number of travel books were revealed to be faked, written from the comfortable position of one's home library, full of all the dull but essential facts, but without the travail of travel. And throughout the 18th century, there's an anxiety that haunts all of the literature about authenticity, particularly runs through travel narratives. In the 18th century, many travelers their preface says, trust me, this really happened, and they have to advertise the truthfulness of their experience. But many were revealed to be what Percy Adams calls a travel liar. And in the 20th century, this turns into the con man, a savvy modern man who's adept and able to perform and succeed in rooted and destabilized culture. The travel liar and the con man are closely related cousins. For example, Anthony Pohl, in his novel What's Become of Waring, gives us a travel writer called T.T. Waring. And he's both a travel liar and a con man. A famous romantic travel writer, and he's thought to have died suddenly, but no one, including his agent nor his publisher, has ever seen him. Because he had sent all of his manuscripts in from abroad. Eventually, he's found to be alive and well and living in the south of France under various assumed names. And he has cribbed all of his adventures from his library. Never been to any of the exotic locales he wrote about, and his travels had all been dreamed up. However, Waring's expat life in France, tricking gullible readers with tales of fake travel, positions him as a more sophisticated protagonist than the naive readers and tourists he conned. He is cultured and witty, well-read, and he lives the life he wants to in sunny France, not in dreary England. Though the nature of travel and touring changed after World War II, a sense of sophistication and culture still clung to the act of travel. And Waring, as con man, is the natural inheritor of the legacy of that kind of learned sophistication. The legacy of the Grand Tour, with its complex associations of privilege and prestige, and still to this day influences where travelers go and what they do. But nowadays, the con man is no longer an outsider. He's a symptom of our complex and ambivalent modern world, one who absorbs and demands the desires of a consumer culture and performs his role better than most of those. In Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley, the places, I don't know, have any of you? Patricia, in her novel, though, she uses the places of the Grand Tour, particularly Italy and France, to trade in a culture based on consumption, but still influenced by the echoes of culture and learning. Highsmith sends her protagonist, Tom Ripley, on a twisted version of the Grand Tour, one in which the outsider con man is the most authentic embodiment of the traditions of Western culture, while the real inheritors of that culture elegantly turn their back on those traditions. Ripley is able to convincingly fake his education and sophistication, playing the role of a learned tourist better than the wealthy characters who take that privileged position for granted. Dickie Greenleaf and Marge Sherwood, who are the two scions of wealthy families, represent a decadent culture, which inevitably ends in loss and death. And Ripley suggests a new kind of cultured protagonist, the con man who consumes culture better than everyone else. John Ury has written in The Tourist Gaze that tourism is about consuming goods and services which are in some way unnecessary. They are consumed because they supposedly generate pleasurable experiences which are different from those typically encountered in everyday life. When we go away, we look at the environment with interest and curiosity. It speaks to us in ways we appreciate, or at least we anticipate that they. The tourist gaze presupposes a system of social activities and signs which locate the particular tourist practices, not in terms of its intrinsic characteristics, but through the contrast implied with non-tourist social practices particularly those based within the home and paid work. So the age-old dichotomy of home and abroad, Uri suggests, is work and the social world and of work versus that of leisure. As a social practice, the Grand Tour was very much constructed around societal beliefs and values of privilege, culture, and sophistication, as well as leisure. Highsmith's Tom Ripley yearns for all of this in a way that reflects the class distinctions and cultural anxiety of post-war America. In Ripley, Highsmith creates a character whose idea of culture and taste is very much constructed by the pre-war world, where class divisions were more pronounced. In the novel, Ripley is painfully aware that he's excluded from the class he longs to join, tormented by the fact that there's a better life being led by others in other places, and preferably the great capital. There are others out there who are not trapped inside the gray world of work and limited horizons. He loathes the world he belongs to. Quick summary, he's down on his luck with his latest con about to catch up with him. And coincidentally, Ripley is approached unexpectedly by the father of Dickie Greenleaf, who believes that Tom has attended Princeton with Dickie. Dickie has turned his back on his father's shipbuilding business and become a painter living in sunny exile in the fictional town of Monticello on the Amalfi Coast. In a reworking of Henry James' The Ambassadors, Mr. Greenleaf asks Tom to go to Italy to try to persuade his son to come back to home and work. However, unlike James's 1903 novel, in which the conventional American Lambert Strother is seduced by the complicated loveliness of Paris, Highsmith's Ripley has already been seduced by the glamorous world he's seen in film and advertising, and he has studied that world very carefully in order to be able to play the part well when he's finally able to enter it. For a poor boy from a broken home, he has a remarkable awareness of the fineness of things. The luxury, the heavy linen of a Brooks Brothers shirt, the mob stationery he uses to write his letters, the fine grain of an alligator wallet. In a novel where taste is everything, his taste is sometimes suspect by those who were born into the privileged classes. But he's a perfect consumer, carefully studying the forever out-of-reach life that advertising sells, as well as the perfect performer, enacting the great American myth. He could convincingly perform his role as Princeton graduate, because earlier he had been friendly with a Princeton of nothing but Princeton. Like the old joke, because I'm from. How do you know when someone's graduated from Harvard? So this is the same kind of joke he's playing on in this novel. So Tom has pumped his friend, for more and more information, foreseeing a time when he might be able to use it. So his education by association is finished with the Grand Tour, provided by Mr. Greenleaf, and it is in Europe where Ripley prepares himself for his next role as a cultured member of the upper class. His acquaintances from his sordid life in New York now begin to annoy him, referring to his impending voyage as something out of the movies, or in a rare moment of culture for the group of cons and grifters, Shakespeare. During his last night in New York, Ripley thinks to himself, a lot that sordidness mattered now. As soon as he could get a passport, he'd be sailing for Europe, probably in a first-class cabin, waiters to bring him things when he pushed a button, dressing for dinner, strolling into a big dining room, talking with people at a table like a gentleman. Just the thought of his embarking on his tour makes him feel differently about himself. Slowly he took off his tie, watching every move he made as if it were somebody else's movements. Astonishing how straighter he was standing now. What a different look there was in his face. It was one of the few times in his life that he actually felt pleased. As he moves further from the American life of work and chasing money, becomes more and more a performer of cultural signs, and the choice of his cap to his taste in art and the study of wine. Scholars have written about Highsmith's attention to commodities and consumer goods, but often claim that it merely adds detail. However, this kind of detail is immensely important in travel literature, faked so easily. The precise measurements of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the knowledgeable ways of seeing the art and architecture of Venice, Florence, and Rome had become almost a joke by the 20th century, with writers such as Forster and James mocking the Baedeker-toting tourists who couldn't see the forest for the list to tell everyone that they had seen. In fact, James Pemble, a literature scholar, says that the sheer volume of books that average British and American travelers felt compelled to read before and during their tours of Europe fostered the idea of travel being more work than leisure activity. Highsmith's Ripley is in that tradition, but he studies advertisements. And he's no greedy thief. He does not desire only money. He craves a cultured life filled with possessions that offer assurance of his very existence. He has studied that life with the diligence of a grand tourist studying the classics before embarking on a voyage to Italy. When he assumes the clothes and possessions of Dickie Greenleaf, he inhabits the world of Dickie. He becomes the inheritor of wealth, culture, and sophistication that gives him an identity. He thinks as he sits in a cafe, in a kind of Laurentian sentence here, wonderful to sit in a famous cafe and to think of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, being Dickie Greenleaf. Cufflinks, the white silk shirts, even the old clothes, the worn brown belt with the brass buckle, the old brown grain leather shoes, the kind advertised in Punch as lasting a lifetime, the old mustard-colored coat sweater with the sagging pockets. They were all his now, and he loved them all. The black fountain pen with little gold initials, the wallet, a well-worn alligator wallet from Gucci's, plenty of money to go in it. Here you have a slide of the two Ripleys sitting in the cafe. This is Tom and Dickie Greenleaf, who's the embodiment of the inheritor of the. And once he becomes Dickie Greenleaf, he changes everything. These details in Highsmith's novel do not just add dimension, they are the warp and woof of the narrative. The way the historical and cultural details of painting, sculpture, and architecture work for the traveling classes before the war. So now they're replaced by like Gucci. We don't have Armani yet, but all of the labels become the versions of the kinds of details that grand tourists needed. Ripley comes to his appreciation through study. He's a quick learner and he has a keen eye, more keen than those born into the kind of privilege he aspires to. He's aware that Dickie is not a very good painter, and he wanted Dickie to be so much more. He studies Italian assiduously, knows when to use the subjunctive, but he chooses not to because Dickie had never mastered it. Of course, Dickie's disregard for the correctness is an aspect of aristocratic privilege, and there are several points in the narrative in which Tom's revealed as the fake he knows and fears he is because he's just trying too hard. When he first encounters Dickie and Marge on the beach, he's nakedly revealed, almost literally, out of his social depth. His skin is white, his bathing costume is too small, and he hasn't got the right shoes. In Ripley's case, the clothes really do make the man. I wanted to show a clip from this, but it was very, very white, and his glasses keep falling down his nose, and he is the only person on the beach with the wrong shoes. So they immediately know that he's not. In the film, Dickie, played by the impossibly gorgeous Jude Law, is more snobbish than he is in the novel. But both he and Marge are aware that Tom's not part of their set. When Freddie Miles, who is Seymour Hoffman, sees through Ripley's disguise, he begins to question him until Ripley is basically backed into a corner and kills him because he's being his fear of being exposed. After the murder of Dickie, which unlike the film was not out of desperation but planned and carefully orchestrated in order to steal his identity, Ripley begins his grand tour education in earnest. Now, as Dickie Greenleaf, Ripley is more than a mere tourist with a 2-week vacation, escaping subways, taxis, starched collars, and 9-to-5 jobs. As Dickie, he's an inheritor of the original grand tourists, a traveler, answerable to nobody for the way he spent his time. He takes an apartment near the La Porta Pinciana in Rome, but he only plans to use it as a base for his travels. He wanted to be able, this is a quote, to say in Majorca, in Athens, or in Cairo, or wherever else he was, yes, I live in Rome. I keep an apartment there. He visits the Capitolini and the Villa Borghese, explores the forums thoroughly, continues his Italian lessons, and studies books about food and wine. As suspicion of him begins to grow, he goes to Venice, where he constructs the elaborate lie that will ultimately guarantee him the life he's prepared himself for. Described in the newspaper Oggi as Signor Ripley, one of the young, well-to-do American visitors in Italy, who now lives in a palazzo overlooking San Marco in Venice, echoing James again. Venice represents the culmination of his education. The city was an important stop on the grand tour, and there he felt a sureness in his taste that he had not felt in Rome. That his Rome apartment somehow just didn't quite measure. Thanks to Ruskin and others, Venice has come to be viewed as a symbol of loss and decadence. Henry James famously referred to it as the vomitorium of Boston, and lamented that Venice, and Italy in general, was now being destroyed by the vulgarization of the modern world and the rush of the tourist. Therefore, it was a perfect place for Tom Ripley to feel more at ease with himself, because he is at heart a consumer tourist. By the 1950s, Venice has already become a tourist playground, and Tom is the embodiment of the post-war consumption and American import. The palazzo he lived in was Tom's idea of a civilized bachelor's pad, Venice at least. Checkerboard black and white marble floor downstairs, extending from the formal foyer into each room. Pink and white marble floors upstairs, furniture that did not resemble furniture at all, but an embodiment of Cinquecento music, played on recorders and violas da gamba. Nothing could be further from Dickey's bohemian chic villa in Montebello with its stark furnishings and white walls. Though Dickey did have a shiny espresso machine about 2 feet high, he refused to buy a refrigerator or a modern stove, explaining once to Tom that that was one of the reasons he fled America. Those things were a waste of money in a country with so many servants. What would Emerlinda do if she could cook a meal in half an hour? Tom also has servants in Venice, but unlike the older traditional Emerlinda, about whom Dickey's attitude reflects a rather aristocratic noblesse oblige, Tom's servants are a young Italian couple who worked for an American in Venice before, so they knew the difference between a Bloody Mary and a creme de menthe. The difference in their attitudes about servants is important, and Highsmith loads this kind of detail with great meaning. Having paid help in and of itself is not a bad thing, but Dickey's attitude towards Emerlinda hints at a respect for tradition, the very thing she takes pride in and about which she is an expert, her cooking. Tom employs a young couple and values them for learning how to cater to American tastes, suggesting the American commercial exploitation of Italy's and Europe's present and future. In Rome, Tom was imitating Dickey, so his real attitudes and tastes required restraint. In Venice, he's Signor Ripley with Dickey's money, so he can be the unfettered, consuming man of leisure he's always wanted to be. However, Tom continues to study, feeling that merely to look at the art of other countries would be a pleasant, rewarding life. He had learned a lot while copying Dickey's mediocre paintings, but more sketching in the galleries of Paris and Rome, just as thousands of grand tourists had done before him. When he receives the news that he's gotten away with his elaborate con, he's in Athens to see the Parthenon. Greece, the birthplace of classical learning, was the culmination of the grand tour during the Victorian era. Kimball notes that reflected through the lens of Byron, Shelley, and Keats, Italy and Greece connoted magnificent possibility, mystic revelation, and transfigured destiny. Tom Ripley as well, Greece is gilded with the gold of warrior's armor and with it is the place of his own transfiguration. The police and Mr. Greenleaf all believe that Dickey has murdered Freddie Miles and then committed suicide. The improbable scenario is believed because it's the rational explanation because with Dickey's rejection of American values. Tom, the cultural inheritor of Mr. Greenleaf's American industrialist and Madison Avenue face, is now the Greenleaf's financial heir. He has the freedom, money, and sophistication of Tom Ripley, but live like Dickie Greenleaf. A life made possible through his horrifically unsentimental travel to Italy. Not haunted by guilt or regret as he is at the end of Mangela's film. He's the consummate modern man, the travel liar, the con man, and the diabolical culmination of the American success ethic. The con man establishes a place in society in which identities and values become speculative commodities, and a pragmatic faith in appearances has a chance to create reality, a reality that moves up and onward. It is the idea of advancement, of beating the system at its own game, that makes Tom a compelling protagonist. Highsmith calls into question ideas of cultural value, taste, privilege, and authenticity if they can be performed so easily. Tom gets away with murder because the Dickie Greenleafs of the world are dying out anyway. In the modern world, it's the better consumer who wins. Tom Ripley's education for a life of performance and consumption is a parody of the tradition of education and self-improvement established by the Grand Tour. And the success he makes of it is a reflection of the increasing power of commodity culture, where seeming and having the right accessories is.
Questions? Asking questions?
Sure.
Wonderful, 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 beguiling lecture.
Use the microphone.
Sorry, beguiling lecture, absolutely wonderful. Do you think that the Tom Ripley still exists today in the same way? Do you think that sense of self-advancement when it comes to Europe is still predicated on understanding and taking commodities from Europe back in the same way? Sort of hinted it was in terms of the Chinese and the Japanese, but is it the American psyche?
Well, I think to a certain extent, because I mean, I know that as I said, consuming was always part of the Grand Tour tradition. Buying things, you went to Paris to buy certain things, you bought art here, carted a lot of it away. So I think to a certain extent, but it's shifted. So now it's the long lines outside the Gucci store and the Via Condotti, or it's the, I mean, they're still there, those long lines. But for Americans, I'm not really sure. I think Europe, now it becomes the, like in Yuri's book, The Anti-Tourist, and in The Tourist Gaze, I think Americans now search for something less touristic that marks them out as authentic. So they are looking for, I want to go to where real Romans eat, not just these tourist places. So now that the position of privilege is found in something, but that what I think is probably also true, because I knew you were going to have to ask me something that involved Trump. But the kind of weird parody of the self-made man, right? That what Highsmith does with it, where it used to be the young men were schooled in the Grand Tour tradition to become leaders. What Highsmith plays with that idea in order to play with our ideas of advancement in American culture, that we eschewed all those ideas and that you could be a man. The problem with Ripley is he is that to a murderous degree, and so takes that American self-help ethic. And now we have people just sort of shoving that in our face.
We have to get.
Thank you very much, Lisa. You referred several times to the film version of the novel and showed various stills from it. Do you think the film did justice to the novel, or did it have other messages in it which are valid in their own right?
Well, I think the novel's much darker. And so it ends, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on about the sexuality, because Tom Ripley is, there's a real current of homosexuality in the novel that I think Minghella played on and sort of showed the character as more as this sort of tortured, closeted homosexual, that really was not, I think, Highsmith's emphasis. She really was critiquing consumer post-war values, and if you look at The American Friend and the other Ripley novels, I mean, she sees a lot of problems with the the American influence after World War II in Lend-Lease deals in the Cold War. So there's a lot of that stuff in the novel that the film doesn't get at, and also Tom ends in a very lonely way. You feel sorry for him at the end, and in the book, there's no remorse. He's really an anti-hero in that way. He's really happy that he got away with it, and that he's alone, so that he feels happiest alone. Actually, that no, he can't be exposed. So he's a much darker character in the novel.
Isn't he more American in the book and more English, because Minghella's English in the film, and that's the difference?
Actually, that's very true, because Minghella's playing, I think, especially because in all of the, I mean, Matt Damon, I actually have to say, I thought he was a really wonderful. He really did a great job. But I think Minghella's sensibility is definitely more English. And Highsmith left America, and in the 50s never went back, and she was very, very critical of the increasing influence and power of what she called American imperialism. I think it's why she made that character much darker than Minghella would have just had a different, and would have seen him really as a figure, I think, of sympathy in some way.
Very much, Lisa. Wonderful talk. Most
you.
illuminating.
Thank you.
Made me want to go back and read Patricia Highsmith. She's a very
wonderful.
bleak but extraordinary cerebral writer.
Very dark.
Very, very, very interesting writer. If I remember correctly, she lived near Pisa.
And then in Switzerland. She spent died in Switzerland.
Wonderful writer. Well, thank you very much. It's been an experiment with Ciao Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Thank you to our technical support.
Technical support.
And thank you, Philadelphia. We've all enjoyed being there in spirit.
Yes. Ciao, Philadelphia. Vomitorium. Oh, thank you.
I won't kiss you. I won't kiss you. I'm trying. I'm going to go.